Welcome back, everyone. We've got a really fascinating topic to dive into today, one that sparked some intense discussions among our team.
It's a really big one. We're going to be tackling the question of whether the two world wars, those massive global conflicts that defined so much of the 20th century, could have actually been avoided.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. We've been poring over the work of Patrick J. Buchanan for this one, specifically looking at the lead up to both wars.
It's amazing how he pieces together those crucial decisions, the key figures and the moments, those turning points that really propelled the world into these just devastating conflicts.
It's like, where did it all go wrong? Was there a chance to change course? So in this deep dive, we're going to try to break all of that down for you to look for those critical missteps. And hopefully by the end, we'll all have a much clearer understanding of how things escalated so tragically.
It's really about peeling back the layers of history and seeing those moments where maybe, just maybe, a different choice could have led to a completely different outcome.
So let's set the stage. Buchanan frames this entire period, from 1914 to 1945, as a single, protracted Great Civil War of the West.
Yeah, that's right. It's kind of a chilling way to think about it, isn't it? These wars, not as isolated events, but as interconnected chapters in this much larger, unfolding European tragedy.
It really challenges that traditional view, doesn't it? And it makes you think, if we see it as one continuous conflict, does that change how we understand the causes and the consequences?
It's interesting, too, because this perspective isn't entirely new. Thinkers like George Kennan and Jacques Barzun, they saw World War I as that initial, original catastrophe, the one that really set the modern world on this destructive course.
And then you've got Lloyd George, reflecting much later, actually calling World War II the unnecessary war.
It really raises that central question. Were these wars truly inevitable, or were there points where things could have gone differently?
Okay, so let's rewind way back to the late 19th century. We see someone like Lord Salisbury, a British prime minister, issuing a warning about the dangers of overtaxing a nation's strength. Getting constantly caught up in these little quarrels and disputes.
Yeah, reading that now, knowing what came next, it's almost prophetic. It's like he was sensing this underlying unease, this brewing storm that Europe was just sleepwalking into.
And it's interesting to think about that alongside Napoleon's quote, the one about European wars essentially being civil wars.
Right. It really highlights those deep-seated rivalries and tensions that had simmered for centuries, just waiting for the right spark to ignite.
Okay, so fast forward a bit. It's 1914, and we're seeing this intense wave of nationalism sweeping across Europe. It's almost like a fever that jingoism runs stark mad, as Colonel House put it.
Yeah, it's incredible how palpable that feeling was. He even predicted a cataclysm if things didn't change.
And it's like this wasn't just some outsider's perspective. There was a very real feeling, particularly in Germany, of being surrounded, of being threatened.
That sense of encirclement, whether justified or not, it really played a huge role in the decisions being made, especially in Berlin.
And we can't forget the British perspective here. Their position went through a massive shift after the Boer War.
The Boer War was a real wake-up call. It showed them that they weren't as isolated as they thought, and it definitely made them rethink their whole splendid isolation policy.
And then, boom, we've got Joe Chamberlain stepping in, trying to forge an alliance with Germany.
He was really pushing for this.
Yeah.
He saw this potential for Britain, Germany, even the U.S., all working together to contain Russian expansion and keep the peace in Europe.
But the Germans, they were skeptical. They didn't fully trust Britain's intentions.
They thought Britain would eventually have to come back to them, begging for an alliance.
And of course, that's not how it played out at all. Instead, we've got these secret Anglo-French military talks starting as early as 1906. It's wild. They were actually planning for a potential war with Germany, and this was all happening without the British cabinet even knowing.
Talk about operating in the shadows.
Yeah.
It really makes you question the level of transparency, the accountability in the years leading up to the war.
And while this is happening, we've got Kaiser Wilhelm II completely fixated on his uncle, King Edward VII. He was absolutely convinced that Edward was plotting against Germany, trying to isolate them.
It's fascinating how these personal relationships, these rivalries and suspicions, they actually seeped into high-level diplomacy.
It really humanizes the story, doesn't it? But beyond the personal stuff, the Kaiser makes what looks like a really huge mistake. He decides to challenge Britain's naval dominance.
The creation of the High Seas Fleet, oh man, that was a game changer. You can trace a direct line from that decision to the end of Britain's splendid isolation.
Yeah, they saw it as a direct threat, and they started looking for allies to counter it.
Especially because those German naval laws were so blatant. I mean, Admiral von Tirpitz, he wasn't even hiding his Anglophobia.
Right. The goal was to build a navy powerful enough to take on anyone, even the strongest naval power. And that was clearly aimed at Britain.
It's like they were poking the bear, and the bear was not happy.
But to be fair, we should also consider the German perspective here. They genuinely felt threatened by Russia, this huge modernizing military force on their eastern border.
And don't forget about France. They were still nursing that grudge from the Franco-Prussian War.
And they were both outspending Germany on warships. So from the German point of view, this naval buildup, it could be seen as defensive.
It's all about perspective, right? Each side saw the other's actions as hostile, and it just spiraled.
Okay, so let's jump ahead to that fateful summer of 1914. We've got this intense nationalism, the sense of encirclement, the naval arms race. It's like a tinderbox waiting to explode. And then, bam, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
Talk about a spark.
And even Lloyd George, a guy known for his political savvy, he initially downplayed the whole thing. He called it a very small cloud.
It's crazy how quickly a small cloud can turn into a massive storm.
And Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, he tries to mediate, but his messages about what Britain might do are kind of vague.
He wasn't clear enough. The Germans didn't really know where Britain stood, and that uncertainty, that was a major factor in their calculations.
Meanwhile, back in London, crucial decisions are being made with very little input from the rest of the cabinet or parliament.
And Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, he was pushing hard for war. He saw it as inevitable.
And then you've got Germany's Schlieffen Plan.
Oh, man. That plan was a disaster waiting to happen. It was so rigid, so inflexible, that it basically guaranteed war if things went even slightly off track.
Yeah, their whole strategy depended on a rapid advance through Belgium, and Belgium was neutral.
Which brings us to that whole issue of Belgian neutrality. Britain had signed a treaty guaranteeing it, and they had a huge interest in keeping any hostile power away from the English Channel.
And Churchill and Grey, they knew this. They used Belgium's neutrality to rally support for war. It was their ace of trumps, as Buchanan puts it.
And Lloyd George, even though he was hesitant about war, he was in a tough spot. He didn't want to be seen as abandoning France. And he knew Churchill was right there, ready to take over if he didn't act.
It's like a chain reaction, isn't it? One thing leads to another, and suddenly, everyone's at war.
And the author's argument is that if Grey had just been upfront about Britain's position, if he'd told Germany clearly that they'd intervene, things might have gone differently.
Yeah, maybe Germany would have thought twice before invading Belgium, knowing that Britain would join the fight.
And think about the consequences of that decision. Britain entering the war, it led to the failure of the Schlieffen Plan, to that horrific trench warfare, and ultimately to the Treaty of Versailles, which laid the groundwork for Hitler's rise.
Grey was convinced that if France fell, everyone else would topple like dominoes. He thought fighting was the only way to stop Germany from dominating all of Europe.
But even with those stakes, the level of debate, the real discussion within the British government, it was shockingly low. They basically stumbled into war.
And it's interesting because, we often think of Germany as this super militaristic aggressor. But in reality, before the war, they were actually spending less on their military than France or Russia.
And that September program, the one outlining all of their ambitious war goals, it came after Britain declared war, not before.
So maybe, just maybe, if Britain had demanded guarantees, things could have been different. Maybe Germany would have backed down.
The author even points out that both Asquith and Grey, they later admitted that Churchill was really eager for war.
And then there's that whole thing about Britain cutting Germany's transatlantic cables.
That was a smart move, strategically. They basically controlled the flow of information to America.
So the picture we're getting here is a lot more nuanced than just, Germany bad, everyone else good.
Right. It's way more complicated than that.
Okay, so the war ends, and we've got Lloyd George, who, surprisingly, calls for a magnanimous peace. He warns against that poisonous spirit of revenge.
But unfortunately, that's not the path they took. You know Kennan's line, suffering doesn't make people more reasonable. Well, the Treaty of Versailles is a perfect example of that.
It was brutal. France, especially Clemenceau, they were all about punishment.
And Churchill, even after the fighting stopped, he supported the naval blockade of Germany, which basically led to starvation among civilians.
They forced Germany to sign this treaty that they saw as a complete humiliation, a scrap of paper.
It's no surprise that it bred so much resentment, so much anger.
And Lloyd George, even though he wanted to weaken Germany, he was against things like annexing the Rhineland. He thought it would just lead to more trouble down the road.
He wasn't wrong.
And redrawing those borders after the war, that created a whole new set of problems. Look at Czechoslovakia. They were riddled with ethnic tensions.
In Hungary, man, they lost so much territory. It's no wonder they felt cheated.
And there's been this big debate about whether Versailles was a truly Carthaginian peace, one meant to completely destroy Germany.
Well, it was definitely harsh, but Germany did survive, unlike Carthage. But they violated a lot of Wilson's 14 points.
Right. They grabbed German colonies and redrew borders without really considering national self-determination.
It's like they were setting the stage for future conflicts.
And Lloyd George himself predicted another war within 25 years, and he said it would cost 3 times as much.
It's crazy how accurate he was.
They just couldn't reconcile their goals, those allied powers. They all wanted different things.
And they made some other questionable decisions. Ending the Anglo-Japanese alliance, that really destabilized the Far East.
And then you've got the Washington Naval Treaty, which was supposed to limit naval arms races, but it really hurt the Royal Navy.
Churchill was a big supporter of that. He believed in this special relationship with the U.S., but it didn't quite pan out as planned.
And the Stimson Doctrine, that just antagonized Japan without actually doing anything to stop their aggression.
It's like they were setting up all these dominoes, and then they just gave them a little push.
Now, let's shift gears to the 1930s. It's interesting to think that Mussolini actually looked down on Hitler at first.
He thought he was a bit of a joke, this upstart with these crazy ideas.
Mussolini even proposed this four-power pact to revise Versailles, but nobody was interested.
And their first meeting, in 1934, it was apparently a disaster. Mussolini was totally disgusted by Hitler.
And when Dollfuss was assassinated in Austria, Mussolini was furious. He actually mobilized troops to deter Hitler from invading.
So you can see how complicated their relationship was.
But then in 1935, Britain signs the Anglo-German Naval Agreement.
Oh, that was a big one. It basically let Germany break the naval restrictions of Versailles, and it really weakened the Stresa Front, which was supposed to contain Germany.
It basically signaled to Hitler that Britain was willing to let him get away with some stuff.
And then the Abyssinian War. Britain condemns Italy, and Mussolini feels betrayed. He starts to see Hitler as his only real ally.
Even Churchill, who would later become Hitler's biggest enemy, he had actually spoken favorably of Mussolini in the past.
It just shows how unpredictable things were back then.
And France, they were in a really tough spot. They'd pulled out of the Rhineland and built the Maginot Line, which made them look weak and unwilling to defend their allies.
So when Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, nobody stopped him.
And Churchill, at first, he actually praised the French for showing restraint.
It's amazing how much the mood shifted in just a few years.
And then, of course, you've got the Anschluss in 1938, the annexation of Austria.
Britain basically accepted it. They thought stopping it would mean war, and they weren't ready for that.
But there's this whole issue of self-determination, right? There were plebiscites in Austria showing that a lot of people actually wanted to join Germany.
So it's not a simple black and white situation.
And then comes Munich, that infamous agreement where Chamberlain thought he'd secured peace for our time.
Churchill, of course, called it a total and unmitigated defeat.
There's even evidence that a planned coup against Hitler was called off because of Munich. They thought they'd lose public support if the West seemed okay with Hitler's demands.
It's a tragedy of miscalculation and missed opportunities.
And the Sudetenland issue was so complex. There were real grievances among the German-speaking population there.
Even Lloyd George said that giving them more autonomy might have presented the whole crisis.
But France was bound by treaty to defend Czechoslovakia, so they couldn't just let Hitler walk in.
It's all about trying to balance competing interests and principles, and they clearly failed.
And we have to remember that they were dealing with Hitler, not some reasonable Weimar Republic leader.
Chamberlain thought he could appease Hitler, that he could avoid war.
Churchill wanted to ally with the Soviet Union, which Chamberlain was totally against.
And Hitler lied. He said the Sudetenland was his last territorial claim.
Yeah.
But we all know what happened next.
It's like they were playing chess with someone who was playing a completely different game.
So after Munich, things really start to unravel. Hitler takes the rest of Czechoslovakia, and Poland even joins in, grabbing a piece for themselves.
And then the Danzig issue, the Polish corridor, those old wounds from Versailles, they all come back to haunt them.
Hitler wanted an alliance with Poland, but they refused to give him Danzig or a clear path through the corridor.
They knew he'd just keep taking more if they gave him an inch.
And then, when Czechoslovakia finally falls apart, Britain issues that fateful guarantee to Poland.
It was a huge gamble, and they knew they couldn't actually defend Poland if it came to war.
Churchill had his doubts, but Chamberlain and Halifax were worried that Poland might cut a deal with Hitler, giving him another victory.
And of course, Hitler is furious about the guarantee, and Poland gets even more stubborn about Danzig.
It's like they're all locked in this death spiral.
And the author makes a really interesting point. He says that guarantee to Poland was Chamberlain's fatal blunder.
He argues that it led to an unnecessary war over a territory that wasn't even that important to Hitler in the long run.
And when the invasion came, there was no real help for Poland.
Chamberlain tried to get a conference going at the last minute, but it was too late.
The French made a few token advances, but they weren't serious about fighting for Poland.
Poland gets crushed, and Hitler is free to turn his attention to the West.
And who benefits from all of this? Stalin. He ends up swallowing up half of Poland thanks to that guarantee.
It's like they played right into his hands.
And Hitler, at the start of the war, he threatens to annihilate the Jewish race in Europe if things escalate. It's terrifying.
It makes you wonder if that guarantee actually put the Jews in more danger.
The cost of the war, in human lives, in resources, it was staggering. Was it truly necessary?
The author suggests that Hitler's main goal was to avoid a two-front war.
Yeah.
He wanted an agreement with Britain.
And the evidence kind of supports that. The West Wall, the German Navy's weakness, the Luftwaffe's focus, it all points east.
In Churchill, later on, he actually softened his stance on blaming the Kaiser for World War I.
It's like the more you look at it, the more complicated it gets.
And then you've got this whole clash of ideologies, Nazism versus communism.
And the America First movement in the U.S.
It was a messy, chaotic time, and it's hard to say for sure what the right decisions were.
So the big question is, was it wise to declare war on Germany over Poland, a country Britain couldn't even save, if Hitler's real ambitions were elsewhere?
It's a question historians are still debating today.
Now, we can't end this deep dive without talking about Churchill. He was a complex figure, brilliant but controversial.
A staunch opponent of appeasement and, of course, a wartime leader who inspired millions.
But even he acknowledged that the war had a huge cost for Britain.
They ended up economically dependent on the U.S., and their empire was gone.
And Kennan's reflection on the Germany of 1913, it's sobering. Maybe things could have been different.
It's easy to look back and judge, but the reality is they were making decisions with imperfect information in a rapidly changing world.
The Cold War, Reagan's approach to the Soviet Union, it all contrasts with what Britain did before the wars.
It makes you think about the long-term consequences of those early choices.
The author even talks about the influence of that Wilsonian ideology of democratic fundamentalism in U.S. foreign policy and the potential dangers of trying to be the world's policeman.
There are definitely parallels to Britain's own experience with imperial overreach.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the key takeaway is that history is rarely simple.
These wars weren't inevitable. They were the result of a series of decisions, miscalculations, missed opportunities.
And by understanding those choices, we can hopefully gain some insight into how to avoid making similar mistakes in the future.
It's all about recognizing those patterns, those dynamics that can lead to conflict.
So here's a final thought for you. If you could go back and change one decision, one key moment, what would it be? What could have changed the course of the 20th century, prevented those wars, that unimaginable suffering? It's a lot to ponder.
It is. It's a question worth thinking about.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.